So everyone, welcome to our session with Chet Ensign and the OASIS tab on how to approach standards and specifications for the baseline protocol community. It's great to see everybody here. Chet, maybe you can introduce yourself a little bit, and then we can start off this. And by the way, if it's not objectionable to anybody, I'd like to post this to our YouTube channel so that people that can't be here today can learn a few things about standards and specifications if they want to sit through that kind of a session.
Great. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, good. I switched some things around and sometimes that switches off my microphone, so good. So yeah, hi everybody. I'm Chet Ensign. I'm the technology community steward for OASIS, which basically means that I'm the person who works with technical groups to make sure that work gets done within the rules that apply, that that work gets out for review or gets promoted as appropriate. Also act as a sort of trail guide, den mother, referee, rules interpreter. Many times it's explaining how to get something done without violating a rule that would complicate matters when it came time to formal approvals. So that's pretty much what I do all day, is work with the various committees to keep things moving along. I've invited, or rather I asked John, and John invited the members of the Technical Advisory Board. I see that Ashok Malhotra is on the call, also Jacques Durand, Patrick DeRusso, and Stefan Hagen. These are longtime OASIS members who have put a lot of documentation through the pipeline, have a lot of experience with both the technicalities and the intricacies of an OASIS specification, but also with basically just general editorial work in general. And so they're people who, they're interested because you're going to be one of the first open projects actually producing specification documentation, and B, they can be helpful in terms of giving you advice or feedback on how to proceed with stuff.
And Chet, when you say that we're one of the first open projects, maybe for viewers, it's important to understand the distinction. OASIS has been running for what, 40 years, 45 years?
Since 1993, yeah, whatever that works out to.
This is a pretty mathy group here, so I'm waiting for the slide rules to come out.
It's going on 30 years at this point, right? Yeah.
Oh, 30, okay.
Yeah.
Still not bad. 20 years longer than Linux Foundation. Or at least 10.
Yeah.
Oh, anyway, so when you say that the open projects is a relatively new program for OASIS, right?
Right, about a little over a year old at this point.
Right.
So we've had the technical committees working under the OASIS Standards project for years, producing drafts that advanced through to become OASIS standards, and some even moving on to be submitted to ISO or to IEC, ITU. So
what does one get for being an OASIS standard, and then what does that mean, and what are the implications of that going forward? Traditionally, not just with open projects, but for all of the history of OASIS. Not everybody may know what the benefits are and what the importance of being an OASIS standard is. Maybe some examples of previous OASIS standards.
Right. Well, I think one of the big benefits of being an approved standard generally is that various types of entities look favorably upon that when they're putting together specifications, or what's the word I'm looking for? Basically, when they're putting out requests for proposals or specifying what needs to go into product proposals to them, procurement specs. they will specify, you know, the system must support MQTT version 5. The system must support KMIP version 2.1. You know, they'll use those as specifications. Also, it gives it locks in the IPR promises so that adopters who want to take a specification and implement it into their systems can look at the licensing mode that the committee has adopted and know, you know, what is applicable. So, you know, okay, so the MQTT TC is operating on non-assertion mode. Okay, I don't have to worry that one of these people is going to show up at my door, you know, with their request for patent royalties or any of that. So it provides security there, and also, you know, the reputation that OASIS brings. People know if something is an OASIS standard, that it underwent public reviews, that the project team had to respond to those review comments and address them in their work. That it has been through approval processes, you know, so that they can trace it all backwards, and they can be assured that, you know, nobody sort of dove underground, did a lot of black magic behind their backs, and then popped up later with something there. It's been done on a process that they trust, and of course, being then further adopted as an international standard means that internationally it's accepted. It's part of the reason that OASIS is both an ANSI standard, accredited ANSI standards developer, meaning that we can send something to the American National Standards Institute, and it will be published as an ANSI standard. You know, the TC wants them to have it done. We turn it over to them. They publish it. It's done. And likewise, we are engaged with a lot of the activities in Europe, both the European Commission committees and what they call the multi-stakeholder platform, which is where the European countries have got representatives working together to produce lists of approved standards that that the member companies can use to create interoperable applications that work cross-border, cross-language, what have you. And it's because of our reputation and our process that we're engaged in all of that. So, so I think that, you know, those are some of the benefits. You know, you get the benefit of being associated with the OASIS reputation, and also the fact that that people will then cite to it and say, "Yep, use this." Does that give you a pretty good answer?
Yeah, fantastic answer. Thank you. So, and feel free, everybody. I'll kind of play moderator here and ask some and prompt for some things. People have been asking me about some stuff, but everybody else is very welcome to chime in, right? Or would you like to just run through everything?
No, let's make it a dialogue.
Okay.
I've got some slides. If I can, and I'll send them to you after the meeting. I put them together yesterday. And yes, Brian, that's exactly what the slides are going to go over, the overall process. So let me share PowerPoint here. Okay, so you can all see the screen, right? Okay, I'm going to jump to slide number 3 first and give you the rough diagram of the process to sort of walk it through. Basically, it's a series of drafts and approvals at various stages along the way that lead up to the OASIS standard. And I talk about the procedures for getting this process started in the next slide here. But quickly, the way that this works is you all work on project specification drafts. We can provide templates. We've got templates set up, templates and style sheets set up to do this in Markdown. The OSLC-TC, the Open Software Lifecycle. I always forget what the C stands for. Anyhow, They're also working on specifications at this point. They're actually using a customized version of the W3C respect editor. So they're actually working in HTML as their editorial format. Both work for us. So the members of the project can go through and develop specifications and compile them into project specification drafts. You can do that in GitHub, and if you like at any given point, you can give a project specification draft over to us, and we'll publish it in the project library, the OASIS approved work library. We have the one that we've used for years for technical committees on the standard side is docs.oasis-open.org. Each committee has a directory under that, and then underneath that, all of their work products. The one that we've set up for open projects, and the reason we set up a different one, a different server there, was to give the open projects more flexibility. There's some restrictions on naming conventions and directory structure and what have you that we wanted to give the open projects more flexibility on that. So we set it up as docs.oasis-open-projects.org. And OSLC already has a I think it's one draft published there, but that's optional. That's up to you. At some point, the technical steering committee may say, "Hey, this thing is ready to go. You know, we've been banging code against it for a month now. You know, we haven't found any holes. We've checked with the OP administrator. You know, there's nothing missing here. This thing is good to go." And so the TSC can make a recommendation to the project governing board to say, "Hey, we think that this work is ready for approval as a project specification." The project governing board then asks me to run a special majority vote. That's basically the same. It's sometimes called a supermajority vote. In OASIS vernacular, it's special majority. 2/3 of the voters must vote. 2/3 or more must vote in favor, and no more than a quarter can vote against. Basically, three members on a PGB, 2 would have to vote yes. But once the PGB approves it, it then becomes a project specification. And at that point, we publish it to the OASIS-open-projects library, and we set all of the cover data, cover page metadata to reflect the fact that it's a project specification. And this is the equivalent to what's called a committee specification on the standard side. It's the point at which the licensing locks in. Anybody can come in and make use of this specification, knowing what the licensing terms are, because everybody's made that commitment. And effectively, it is a standard at that point in all but name, because the next steps, if you want to move it forward, are on the existing content. The content doesn't continue to change at that point. You can, of course, continue to work on new specification drafts, but they're going to then be, you know, version 2 of the project specification, version 2.5, whatever. But the project specification itself, once it starts to advance, the content is frozen.
So Chet, yeah. 2 things. One, can you maybe zoom in a little bit on the graphic? I think on screen.
Sure.
Small. Thank you. And I imagine that a lot of folks might wonder, who aren't familiar with the standards process, that today we have sort of we have a reference implementation. Hyperledger has a bunch of code. People seem to be standardizing on that, on many of those things, right? So Fabric doesn't have an official standard, right? But in Corda, I don't think it's an official standard. Lots of different projects don't have standards, and yet people standardize on them. And we have a lot of documentation. We're getting better at that. What sets apart the standard? I mean, there's a lot of process, and I think people would do well to understand what is a material difference between, writing up some good documentation and having a good reference implementation and having an actual official standard that went through this process.
That's a really good question. I think, let's see. I'll just,
in particular, within the context of the fact that we're already under the ECLA of the OASIS, so we have,
yeah,
we
that's
have the patent protection stuff and all that stuff.
Yeah. One of the things that I think is different is that first of all, a lot of times when you're talking about something documented as a specification, you're talking about something that someone may choose to implement in some other form. So you've got a reference implementation running, you've got a specification documentation about that reference implementation and all the inputs and outputs and the data formats and what have you. And somebody may come along and go, well, gee, that's really nice, but I'd rather write it in, I don't know, Ruby on Rails, So they're going to take that specification and they're going to want to produce an equivalent functional piece of code themselves. So they're going to want to know, okay, so what is the input? What are the inputs? What are the outputs? What are the data transformations that I need to enable inside? What are the ranges? What are the variations? What are the optional pieces? What are the required pieces? So they're going to be looking to that specification for that. And they're going to want to know that that's not going to just suddenly change, because somebody had, a great idea at a 4th of July picnic, or it wasn't at a 4th of July picnic, and as a result had a great idea and rewrote a whole bunch of code in the reference implementation. And now that's out of sync with the specification documentation until we get that caught up with it. And now it's caught up and, oh, but wait, you're already writing something else. You're now out of sync. So there's a certain comfort in the, in knowing that that thing will not change without warning, and that it changes through a process, that they can keep tabs on. So I think that's one of the differences. And in particular, I think when people talk about, putting things into procurement, they really want to know, that this is not going to change dramatically and without warning. They're going to want to know if there's some stability involved. So it's a matter of balancing the agility of the open source process with stability and predictability of standards process, and finding a middle ground so that the agile development can continue on, but people can rely on this version of the specification for what they're doing at this time. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It did to me. That was really a great question and a really great response. I wanted to ask, related to that,
Okay.
do you find that it's best, because and I think what you said is really applicable to the baseline protocol, because it is not like a particular database technology that's really specific to a particular language, or it's not a thing. It's more of a loosely defined set of actions and activities that you take on both mainnet, public, private, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So it seems to fit that definition of like, it really should be a standard pretty quickly, I think, to help solidify the big core ideas behind it. Is it better to kind of go wide with the first standard, or focus on specific parts that we know we want to nail down and move those forward first? Like, do you see what's a better approach, or is maybe another third alternative? Is it better to kind of have a very sort of, maybe not like a more vague version 1 that covers everything, or a version 1 that's like really specific about certain areas where we really have confidence in as a community?
Boy, I tell you, now that is a good question. That is like that is like the you know, the philosophy course 101 of standards development. That's like a fundamental question.
Okay, do you have any advice?
From my experience watching a lot of groups work at OASIS, the groups juggle the demands and the needs in different ways. But what I would say I routinely have, what I've seen is groups try to determine a problem set that that they know needs to be solved, that has high priority to it, that there's going to be value to the community, to the user community in getting stabilized and addressed, and they attack that first. Now, so it's really interesting to see what happens. Some groups start and they create the mega specification document, and they jam as much stuff into it as they can. And then as they start working on their next refinements, they go, oh, wait a minute, we've got this one minor problem over here in the in the vocabulary, but in order to fix that, we've got to produce an entirely new iteration of this standard. That's going to be a hell of a lot of work for a small change. So we'll wait on that, or what I've seen happen a lot is they get this mega standard, and then they find out that the thing is like a beast to maintain, and then you end up with number 2 being broken into 4 parts that are much easier to manage, and a different editor takes on the editorship of the different parts, so that you've got focused expertise in charge of each of those areas. So that's one of the things that I've seen happen. The other thing I've seen happen is groups start with like 6 or 8 smaller specifications that they work on, and then all of a sudden they're trying to figure out how they keep these things in sync independently of each other, and they end up rolling them back up into 1 or 2 large documents. So the answer I would say is, in general, you're better off going with a core set of problems, get those solved, get those documented, and then start building on top of that. Because first of all, it's just a more manageable time frame. You can get something done in 6 months instead of 2 years. And secondly, it gets something into the hands of the user community that much faster, so that you start getting feedback from outside, and it helps there. I'm just thinking the Cyber Threat Intelligence Committee produces a specification called STIX, which is okay, I obviously didn't have enough coffee this morning. Basically, STIX is a language for describing cyber events and cyber attacks. I mean, that's really what it is. It's a standard way to characterize these things and where they came from and who found them and blah, 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 blah. And I think that they are working on STIX 2.2 at this point. They came in with a mega standard that they contributed that was written in XML. And so the first thing they said was, well, this is a typical government project, with bloated code and way too many use cases and verbose to beat the band. So the first thing they did was, we're going to rewrite this in JSON. We're just going, or Java rather. We're going back to Java on this, because that will make that'll make it something much more useful to to the broader development community. So they did that, but they found that the thing was too big, and so they said, okay, well, what's the 75% that everybody needs? What are the cases in here that everybody needs? So STIX 2.0 was sort of the core set of capabilities that they needed to deliver, re-rendered and improved and streamlined and such. And now they've been releasing a set of iterations where they add on those additional use cases. None of this is easy, by the way. I mean, the discussions, because I watch all this stuff go by, and the debates and discussions about, well, here's 3 things we need to address at some point. We can only address one in this release. Which one is it going to be? You know, those are lively debates. You know, but what they have done, which I think is relevant to your question, is they've taken the core set and then they've iterated up, you know, in a series of increments that take them anywhere from 3 to 6 months to do.
Okay. Thanks. That was very helpful. In the sticks example, when you said they publish something and then they put an additional piece in, does the whole thing have to go through, like, if it
the whole specification moves through the process again? Yes.
Oh, okay. I wasn't sure if it was like, you know, like as a developer, Git pull request. It's like you have your mainline master, and then you only actually get reviewers who review the differences. So I was wondering if just the differences went through the process and not the whole thing. Okay.
Well, so that's a good point. The specification documentation itself, the whole spec document moves through the process again. But, you know, one of the things that they make clear in the you know, in their publication, their call for public review, is here's what's changed. You know, so yes, the documentation covers all of these. We're dealing with these 2 use cases right here this time, or these 3 use cases at this time. And so then they direct people's attention in on that.
Okay, that makes sense. Thanks.
Great. Okay, so the next steps here are how a project specification gets from project spec to OASIS standard. So you need to gather a minimum of 3 things we call statements of use. For technical committees, this is to some extent a tooth-pulling exercise. For you guys, it'll be a no-brainer, because the statement of use is a pretty minimal statement that, you know, this party has implemented this project specification approved on this date, you know, in practical application use, you know, and they may go on to explain how it was used and what have you, but literally that's all they have to say is yep, that spec right there, we put it into action. We can guarantee that it's been put to use. As I say, some will go on and say, here's the products, here's what they do, here's how they interact with other products, how we've successfully demonstrated it, and some of them just make the statement. But you really need to produce a minimum of 3 statements. Now, of course, you guys are working on top of implementations of code. So I imagine it's going to, yeah. Okay, so which of you guys want to write this? Because you can write it right now, because you've already got code out there that's running on it. So, but you get those 3 statements of use, and then the project governing board votes to approve submitting it to OASIS as a candidate for OASIS standard. So at that point, we take the package and we put it forward to as broadly as we can, the entire OASIS membership and anybody else that you know put it on this mailing list, put it on this mailing list. We make it as public as possible, that it is out for a 60-day public review. Now, the reason that we do this is mainly to stay in line with World Trade Organization requirements governing. I always forget exactly which part of it, but basically the WTO says, you know, if you're going to use standards in trade, you know, covered by WTO regulations, then it must at least have 60 days of exposure to public review, so people have a chance to look at it, experiment with it, what have you. So we do that to stay within the WTO guidelines, which is not so critical for us, but definitely matters if you want to go on to ISO or IEC or IT or any of them. So at the end of the 60-day public review, If you've had comments and feedback, we've got a mechanism for what you need to do then to respond to those. And if you don't have any, that's fine. That's fine. At a certain point after that, we put it out to the OASIS membership as a whole with a call for consent to make it an OASIS standard. It's a 14-day open ballot, and really what it is a call for objections. So the people can vote yes, but the only thing that the only thing that causes action is if somebody issues an objection, which we've been doing it this way for 2 years now, and we've yet to have any objections to them. For the most part, people believe it's been through the process, so we're happy to see it go to OASIS standard. Once the call for consent is done, then it becomes approved as an OASIS standard, and we publish it and announce it, and we add it to our list of standards, and then you take it from there. So that is the end-to-end process. And hang on a second, let me just, so here it is in text, and the link here will take you to the Open Project progression of work section where it explains that all in detail. So the procedure for getting this started is you request a specification template for a particular piece of work, and we work with you to determine things like what's the title going to be, what's the abbreviation for the file name going to be, some odds and ends like that, and we put together a template. So send it to you in Markdown, send it to you in HTML, which whatever format you want to work in Word. The TCs, many of the TCs like to work in Word. Well, we have a few now who are really have embraced Markdown and are loving it. The Open Command and Control TC in particular is doing a lot of development in Markdown now, and so we're learning a lot through their experiences. We've got an editor's manual that the tab put together. It's in a set of 4 Google Docs, starting with this one here. Talks about what the editor's job is and what we find works in terms of the protocol, or in terms of the working methodology for the editors. In general, 1 or 2 editors. Most works have either 1 or 2 editors. Some have a few more, but 1 or 2 is generally pretty good. Our experience has been that it's more effective to have an editor as the gatekeeper for the actual changes to the to the content. Now, I think that's I'll look at what the OpenC2TC has been doing, because I know that they have been doing that they have people doing pull requests, but we found in terms of collaborative editing experience, we found particularly in the work on sticks, which was done on Google Docs, which is another option, by the way. We can set you up with templates in Google Docs. But what we found was when the first round where they just said to everybody, hey, go in, it's open, you can make your comments and propose edits and things, they found it impossible to keep that process under control and keep it neat. And the documents turned into a tangled web of cross comments and changes and what have you. And so they switched back to a position where they used issue tracking to keep track of the specific issues they were dealing with in editing the document. People made comments and proposed changes on the issues, and ultimately it was the editor's job to handle the process of debating the proposals, getting agreement on the proposals. Once they had consensus on the proposals, the editors then merged them in and marked them as as approved changes. It made it much easier to keep the documents in a readable form and keep the keep the process separated into an area where they could really keep the debates encapsulated to each one of the issues and manage them. So we find that the role of editor is very much one that is an important one to making this process work. So that there's sort of one, because it's the editor's job to actually make sure that the consensus of the team is properly reflected in the text. And so as much as doing text editing, they're also sort of project managing. They're project managing the presentations of the various issues at points along the way, gathering of comments, and ultimately presenting the thing and saying, hey, are we ready to approve this as a committee, as a project specification draft? We are. Great.
What project did you say that was that used pull requests?
OpenC2. It's called OpenC2. I'll make a note to send you links to some of their stuff.
Is it possible to have or do you find that projects find mentors in other OASIS projects? Because like I would love to talk to someone from that project just about that process, and understand what it would take to kind of manage as an editor that workflow.
I'll be happy to put you in touch with people, and that's part of the reason I invited the other members of the tab as well, is that they've also been through this ringer numerous times, and they can also provide you with feedback. I can put you in touch with a couple of people on the OpenC2 project who've definitely been working this process. They've done a really good job. In addition to the using markdown and pull requests for editorial purposes, they've also put together process documentation that I'm stealing from left and right because it's so good. So I will definitely make the connection there.
Thanks.
Yeah. I think this just repeats what I said before. The TSC approved the project specification drafts, recommends it to the PGB for consideration as a project specification. A little bit more detail on how it goes out to candidate OASIS standard. So I think we've covered all of that. The templates, like I said, we can depending on how you all want to work on the documentation, we can provide template in Markdown, Google Docs, Respec, Word. That's the main set of selections there. The one other thing that I thought I'd mention is the template does come with some required sections. There's some cover page metadata that we work out. References if your work relies on any outside specifications. For example, if there's encryption algorithms that you incorporate and you need to cite to the standard document there, they need to be there. The key one that I wanted to point out here was the conformance clause section. Conformance clauses, and Jacques Duran in the tab has written a couple of documents on conformance clauses. They are basically statements of what elements in the specification must be satisfied in order to claim that you conform to the specification. So for example, if you're building a KMIP server, a key management protocol server against the KMIP standard, there's a series of sections within the specification that have required normative clauses that you have to satisfy. And why is this important? Well, the reason the conformance clause section is important is, one, it gives somebody a real simple way to find out quickly what parts of the spec they need to pay attention to in order to build an implementation of it. And secondly, because the OASIS IPR promises apply to conforming applications, you need to tell somebody how to be a conforming application. You know, if somebody decides they're going to use the KMIP specification to, I don't know, you know, write a, you know, write a new, you know, vehicle charging spec or create a vehicle's charging application. Well, nobody's going to stop them from doing that, but they also don't have any of the coverage of the, you know, of the non-assertion clauses because, hey, you guys went and did something completely and totally off the farm here. So the conformance clauses are important from that perspective.
So Chet, it sounds like one of the things that, first of all, I don't know if you've seen our GitHub or Gitbook documentations.
I took a quick glance at it. I didn't look at it in detail yet.
I gotta say, you know, the Gitbook isn't perfect for everything, but it does present the stuff nicely. People like the docs. And so we're thinking that we would actually publish them, right? You know, as these things go to sort of better and better documentation and ultimately to specification, that we would ultimately pump it out right there on the same environment as we have the docs. That way everybody can go to the same place. Is that acceptable? So
let's talk about that. I think that there's a way to make that work, and I think that that's going to be an interesting question to work through. You know, the ultimate goal is to have something that can be referenced, that people can rely on, you know, remaining unchanged.
Maybe there's a master document, we publish it through the specification or through the docs as well, but we also have, like, you know, something that can be PDF'd and all that.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. So the question here is, or my second question is on the template. It sounds like we need to make the case strongly that as opposed to just having some code and some, you know, a way of doing things, that we have to really make the case, because it's not like a IEEE, or it's not like we're doing a radio frequency standard or something where there's some government power to enforce, right? Nobody has to use this specification.
Right.
We have to really strongly make the case that you want to, because unlike some things where you can write an application, it doesn't have to work exactly the way every other application does, or standards of practice can evolve. This thing doesn't work unless lots of different things do some of them the same way, right? So that's why it's a spec and not a standard, not simply, you know, some code that works, right?
Right.
So to make that case, can you take us through, or maybe you're about to, you know, sort of the details of how is that case made, and how is that presented in the form? Yeah. So you said that there's these templates. Could you give us an example?
Well, let me go to. So here's, open services for lifecycle collaboration, right? So here is the GitHub specs where let's see, is this going to work? Okay, tell you what, hang on a second. Let me stop sharing.
You know, right click it.
Can you excuse me for one moment? The doorbell's ringing.
Yep, no worries.
I'll be right back.
All right, Brian, take it away. Can you finish it?
Okay, well, I do have stuff to talk about, but I don't know if so I wondered though, and maybe there's someone else on the call can answer this, but if anyone's had any luck with like specifications that are actually computable, like where you're writing, whether writing the, you know, I'm imagining the language, but then you know, it must implement such and such interface and such a thing, but then it's backed by actual, maybe, I think if there was some last slide that said respec, which if it's anything like RSpec, which is if it's anything like a spec type or Cucumber or any kind of abstract functional requirements type computable DSLs. I wonder if anyone's tried that, and if that's worth the effort to have like your English layer and then, you know, your code layer that like would actually inspect and run. You'd have to pick your abstraction carefully, because you'd want to make it in a language that, or framework that has multiple language implementations. But I wonder if that is something people have tried, or if that's like going way too far down the rabbit hole of
Not to put any one person on the spot, but we have a lot of talent on this call that can't be seen because they, if you're watching video, because they're not sharing their screen. But I mean, Eric, there's a lot of people on this call that know a lot about this. So maybe you guys can comment.
Yeah, I mean, that'd be fantastic. Off the top of my head, I don't know. I can't think of a project that's done that. Maybe someone else knows of one, but that would be super cool.
Yeah, it gets my geek antenna or engineering antennas.
Yeah.
But I don't know if in practically speaking, it would be worth the effort.
Yeah, that's kind of a modeling exercise. If you don't have a model that's done it, we are not sure whether that would work out in the real world. But
yeah,
I'm sorry, Brian, can you run that by me one, because I missed what you were saying there, and there may be some references to.
well, I guess going back to my Ruby on Rails developer days, we used to write functional tests that were in a DSL that defined, it was called RSpec. It was a Ruby specification language, and you wrote it like regular English, and Ruby is particularly good at having this parser framework. So you basically, the idea was you hand it off to product developers and designers to write the product should do this, and a user must be able to log in and that kind of thing. And
I love me some RSpec, Brian.
What was that?
I love me some RSpec, Brian.
Okay. Good. But I'm glad there's some love out there in the room. Or Cucumber is another framework. If you're familiar, it's sort of another evolution of that to a different degree. But the idea was to kind of, you write in English and then you run a parser on it, and that gets you specific words like you do when you write specification, but then it actually turns into computable. You run the code and it executes functions that verify the underlying code. Or I guess in this case, it would be verifying the underlying implementation based on the standard. And I wondered if anyone had tried that and if it was worth exploring, or if it's just too difficult. The whole process of managing just the language is enough, and then to apply code to that, and then to apply a framework to like run that across multiple languages. It's sort of like
It's ringing a bell. I'm going to have to go do some digging around.
Jory mentioned Marcos Caceros, who's been working on some respec features around that.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I've not heard of respec, but it sounds like in the wheelhouse of sort of, or in the ballpark of what I have in mind.
Brian, I would, and I'm happy to make an intro, but talk to Marcos about some of the work he's put in recently to respec and WebIDL, because I think that like what they're trying out there sounds very familiar to what you're describing here.
Okay.
And for viewers of the video, that's Jory Burson speaking, who's the manager of the OP manager for lots of things, including Baseline.
Yeah. So this is the top page for the OSLC spec repository, and you see they've made a nice list here. So I'll use quality management. So you can see that one's it is their second working draft at this point, and this is pretty much how the template renders. The template will go down to the table of contents, and then you take it over from there. But we've got the title. This one's in two parts apparently. The stage is where you can point to where the current copy can be found, the latest copy. We link to the project itself. The project's chairs, the project's editors, other components that go with this piece get listed here. an abstract status, which basically gives anybody who is reading this information about what state this is in. The citation format, we basically write this up so that if somebody else wants to cite this piece of work in theirs, here's how we request that it be done. Obviously, we can't require it. And then the notices section, which is basically the copyright section from that gives OASIS the right to reproduce and what have you. We're making some changes to this. The notices section is going to go to an appendix in the back. Some of the other sections that are going to go to the back. So we're going to reduce this to the useful metadata for somebody. But this is basically how it looks. And so essentially we work with you to put this cover page package together fill in some of the blanks here. And then, like I said, you guys take it away from there, putting together all of the documentation to use. And one of the interesting things that they've done, as a matter of fact, is I believe the way that they have this working is that everything that's yellow is actually a conformance clause that then gets automatically collected up and published at the back of the document. So they've done some interesting things with document automation. But this is basically what the project specification documentation ends up looking like. What was the other example that I was going to say? Oh, right. Here's the, let me go back to that. OpenC2 is a technical committee, but they're using GitHub for a lot of their documentation. And those open repositories can be found in GitHub OASIS TCs. Would it help if I could type? Okay. So here, for example, is their language specification document. And they've got that in a repository, and they're working on it in Markdown. That, of course, is the HTML, which is not rendering, but could. Here's their Markdown. And so there's several people here, Duncan Sparrow and a guy named Dave Lemire. I'll put you in touch with them because they can give you a lot of feedback on how this Markdown documentation process is working for them. So that's about it. That's what I was going to go over today.
This is great. Thank you.
Yeah, Chet, this is fantastic. We're really grateful for the time you spent, and I'm amazed at how many people showed up. I don't think the YouTube will. There's like over a dozen people on this to talk about standards and specifications, right? That's and by the way, keep an eye on Brian. I think he's got a real head for this stuff, and
I'm excited. I'm ready to go. Let's do it.
Cool.
And yeah, for Brian, boring is exciting, man. That's
Boring is the new exciting.
Boring is the new exciting.
And just in closing, I because on the TC side, like we said, we've got going on 30 years worth of practice to draw on, and so there's very few things that come as surprises, although we continue to find ways to improve the process itself, but it's a pretty reliable and stable process. We've got opportunities here with you guys to explore some potentially novel ways of approaching this stuff, and in fact even defining what is a standard coming out of an open source project. One of our long-standing OASIS standards is the DocBook standard, which is an XML standard that's widely used for manuals and magazine articles and what have you. And the reason I raise them is like I say, they literally go back to the mid 90s, but their standard has always been a massive DTD and a very slim document on how to configure it and use it in your software. I have gone back to that one with our team on several times to say, it's not as simple as, oh, this is written documentation, so this is a standard. Oh, this is code. This is not a standard. The DocBook standard is a big hunk of, admittedly, it's DTD, but still, it's a code specification, and the documentation itself is very thin. And I think we're going to find novel ways of merging, code and documentation here as standards that are going to take people by surprise. Oh, it fits these criteria. It's a standard. It's not a standard like I said to somebody the other day. If you want to write a 600-page tome with footnotes and an index in the back, be my guest. That can certainly be a specification. But if you want to write a 6-page, explanation, and then here's all these pieces with all of the functional pieces that you need to do this way, and all of the optional pieces you can figure this, that, or the other way. I don't see any reason why that can't, if it meets the basic criteria, be a standard too. And I think we're going to find that we have some interesting some interesting explorations here that are going to expand the horizons of what constitutes standards. So I'm really looking forward to working with you guys on that.
Right on. Well, and thank you again. Thanks everybody for coming. We're going to move over to our technical steering committee meeting, which is now at the top of the hour. I think many of the people on this call will be over on that shortly if they have the stamina for it, 2-hour call. But Chet, thank you again. And clearly this is, if a big part of the mission for baselining is we're getting an enormous amount of interest from very big companies who are, looking into what is this baseline stuff going on. I hear it every day. I hear about some new large company, some CTO, CIO, CISO that wants to get involved with this stuff or figure it out. And for them, standards matter. So if we can get this to the point where and that's about confidence, right? That they know that it's not going to go away and that things are done correctly.
Right.
And so, if we can use the standards process to get our act together on that, we're going to be way ahead of everything else. So thank you for the time. I'll see you guys on the other call.
Thanks a lot, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.